A lot has been discussed over the last few years about what is and is not in history books and taught in classes across America. Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Civil Rights Movement are all included in high school curriculum, but large segments of the population reply with, well, I never learned that in history class when certain topics come up, specifically from those time periods. So, how do we make sure we have a more accurate teaching of history of America and of the South? Welcome to the fifth episode of the Things You Didn't Know podcast. Joining me today is Dr. Kelly Kennington. She's an associate professor of history at Auburn University and the newly named Drawn Associate Professor in Southern History in the Department of History. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So your research specialization is in slavery in the antebellum South, and you've worked with the state of Alabama's Bicentennial Commission to lead workshops for teachers on how to talk about slavery in Alabama when they're in the classroom. So let's start with the 10,000-foot overview of the issue of slavery in Alabama.
Well, slavery really infused all of Alabama's antebellum economy. You could say that enslaved people built Alabama, built the state of Alabama. So at the time of the Civil War, the eve of the Civil War, the state had the fourth largest enslaved population in the country, with 435,000 enslaved people living in the state, and also composed fourth largest state in the country as far as the percentage of people enslaved, with 45% of the population held in slavery. And so one of the things that I find interesting about Alabama when you think about slavery is all of the different types of slavery that existed here. We typically think of cotton plantations, large-scale staple crop agriculture. But Alabama, one of the things that's unique about Alabama is that the geography of the state allowed for all different types of slavery to exist here. So you do have a huge number of people held on large plantations, growing cotton primarily, but you also have enslaved people working in the mining industry, working in industrial development in the northern parts of the state, working on the rivers and in ports like Mobile, for example. So there's really a variety of types of slavery practiced in the state. And so for me, you often hear, especially with educators, Alabama talked about with the Civil Rights era, and I would argue you can't really understand where that activism comes from if you don't start earlier in with the enslaved population of the state prior to the Civil War.
So now that we have a broad idea of the state's connection to slavery, I want to dig into some of your work on this topic. You received a grant to study the domestic slave trade in Montgomery and Mobile, and you're working on some research regarding women in the legal system during that time period, along with the trainings that we talked about that you've developed on these topics. Why is this kind of work so important?
Well, to me, there's just so much more to be done, so much more to learn about slavery in the state of Alabama. My goal with both of my current projects is to help bring some of the history of enslaved people's lives to life and to light. So the Montgomery and Mobile project, the grant that you referenced, looks specifically at the local conditions of slavery and how laws and local ordinances and practices, really culture of slavery in both Montgomery and Mobile, shaped the institution of slavery and particularly the domestic slave trade in those places. And how all of that affected the lives of the enslaved people living there. Montgomery and Mobile were two of the major slave trading ports and depots of this region, but there's been no studies, at least not to my knowledge, of either of those places. You see studies on Natchez and New Orleans, Charleston and Richmond, but no one's really looked at Montgomery or Mobile, and these are really the places that enslaved people are coming through if they're going to live in the state of Alabama. Now in Montgomery, the Equal Justice Initiative has recently opened I think they just opened a brand new building, museum yesterday, maybe
I think
today,
so, yeah.
Expanding on the museum that they had before. And they've done a lot of work to memorialize the domestic slave trade in Montgomery, including putting up markers to kind of mark the landscape where many of these people lived and worked. in Mobile, the Clotilda Descendants Association is doing some of that work as well, to mark the landscape and to really make the history of slavery and the slave trade in Mobile, more widely known. But in the scholarship, there's just really not a whole lot out there, and so I think that not only my work, but hopefully the work of many others will help bring that to light. The other thing I'll say with the other project I'm working on is trying to get students involved. So I'm working on a divorce suit from Montgomery in 1850, and I have the students read the case every time I teach my American legal history course and do research projects on different aspects of that work. And so when students are able to connect to something really tangible like that, get into the primary sources, get into the local primary sources. For many of them, Montgomery, Mobile, these areas are home. And so that helps them, I think, to make those connections and make all of this history really come to life for them.
One thing that I think has been interesting to hear over the last year, and we talked about this in the intro, is people saying, wait, what? I never learned about that in history class. Things like Juneteenth and the Tulsa Race Massacre, details of slavery in America and other significant events. Why is that?
Well, I think part of it is it's all very difficult history. It's difficult. They're difficult topics for people to talk about. People are uncomfortable often talking about this history. In Alabama, when you think of the history of slavery, the last general history written about slavery in the state of Alabama was published in 1950, so prior to most of what we think of as the Civil Rights era. And so you can imagine that the interpretation in that book is pretty problematic, even going so far as to suggest that slavery was a good thing for enslaved people. And so most people today aren't necessarily using that history, at least not that I know of. But the problem is that history has colored everything that's come after it. So basically everything written since that history that touches on slavery in Alabama uses that book in some way to produce textbooks and popular histories of the state of Alabama. And so that interpretation just kind of creeps in, even unintentionally, I think, sometimes. And so it really shapes how people talk about slavery in this state. And I think a lot of people, including teachers, I talk to teachers about this all the time, find slavery a really difficult topic to approach with, particularly with younger children. And so, it becomes one of those things where it's hard to do when they're in second grade or third grade. Well, it's not really that much easier in fourth or fifth grade. Next thing you know, they're in high school before they've even heard anything about slavery. Right. And so that's where I think a lot of those more difficult topics and stories are difficult, and so they kind of get pushed off to the side. So I guess I would just argue that it's important to try, that there's no perfect way to approach this topic, but that it's important that we all try to make this history known to our children, to our students, and if we can't really understand these painful parts of American history, then I'd argue we can't really move forward.
So that's part of my next question is, how do we move forward? You talk about needing to have these conversations, and you've talked to a lot of teachers about this. What is that jumping off point, and how do we start to introduce this back into the study so that our students get an accurate understanding of what happened throughout the history of America?
Well, I don't think there's one simple answer. That's a big question. If I had that answer, I'd have probably a lot more dollar signs in my paycheck. But I think for me, as an educator, that's where I start, is with education, and not just with my history major students and students that take my history classes, but also education majors and education students. I love working with teachers. I love working with educators. So you mentioned my involvement with the Alabama History Institutes. They started as part of the state's bicentennial effort, funded through the legislature to bring teachers together to learn about some of these different topics in Alabama history. Well, that initiative has continued past the bicentennial, and so I was able to go speak with a group of high school teachers just this past summer at one here in Auburn, but they're all over the state of Alabama. And I love having, future teachers in my classes as well, and just really arming them with that information. They're the experts in how to translate some of that information to students, but a lot of them are missing just the basic content. And so if I can help provide that in some way, then I think that's one step, one kind of tangible thing at least for myself, that I can do. As far as, everyone in general, I think, being open to learning more about this history, seeking out information, and making sure that that information is good information. So those are, all kinds of some of the things that we can do, I think, to try and bring this history to light and to move forward.
Well, I love that you talked about what to do, specifically for those of us that are long past our high school days. Digging deeper is a great way to start that research process, but help us to understand some good ways to make sure that we're getting good information and from a good source to really understand the full context of what was happening during these time periods.
I think the first thing to do is to recognize that our present is shaped by our past. And so in order to understand where we are in this moment, you mentioned George Floyd, but in order to understand 21st century America, you need to understand 19th century and 18th century America. These things don't develop overnight, and so it's something that we have to kind of go back and try to understand. But you're right, you have to seek out good information, and that's not an easy thing these days. And so information literacy is something I really stress in my classes, but I would also stress to the general public to be, healthy skepticism is a good thing. We tend to think, everything is so politicized and that everything has a bias and that bias is always bad. Well, if you just recognize that bias is part of everything, everyone comes to the topics they're discussing with a certain perspective, and your job as a information literate historian or responsible consumer of information is to come to it with a healthy skepticism and ask what that perspective is. And once you understand that perspective, it can help you kind of sort through the information that you're getting. So no source is going to be free of bias or perspective. But if you understand what that perspective is, it can help you, understand what information is right and what information is not good information. I think anytime you can engage with sources from the time period, that's one way to kind of really try to get to know a different era and a different history, is to encounter primary sources from that era. We don't have a lot of sources from enslaved people. We have some narratives. 12 Years a Slave has become really famous over the last decade because of the film made about it, winning the Best Picture Oscar. Right. But there are, dozens of other narratives written by enslaved people or formerly enslaved people. And those are some of, I think, the best sources for this information. But there's lots of other sources from the time period, newspapers, diaries, that sort of thing. Diaries mostly written by, white enslavers. But again, if you go to that information with that kind of healthy skepticism, asking what's the perspective, behind this particular source, that can help you understand, sort of the value of that information. Also, I'll recommend a couple of podcasts because I imagine podcast listeners might want to hear podcasts on the issue. Kidada Williams' Seizing Freedom is one that's a good source for history of slavery. And then also Hassan Jeffries, as a professor at Ohio State, has Teaching Hard History. And he has, I think, at least one, maybe two seasons that are devoted primarily to the history of slavery, but he does all kinds of difficult topics. So those are a couple of, sort of popular culture recommendations I'd make.
Dr. Kennington, these are great tips, and I want to thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the podcast. Your research is so interesting, and I think you gave a lot of people some really great things to think about and some additional resources to look at to help kind of unpack this history and really understand the true history of what's happened in America and across the South. For all of our listeners, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. You'll get notified every time we drop a new episode, and make sure you hit that 5-star button. It helps us out more than you know. We'll see you next time on the Things You Didn't Know podcast.